welcome back to another episode of Aquarium 911. I'm Bentley, and today we're going to deal with, rather than a emergency or a problem, more of a how do I become successful story. This email comes from Scott. And Scott, I would really like to be able to consistently grow aquarium plants. About me, I'm new to planted tanks, but not new to aquariums. I was looking for a way to get back into the hobby last year and came across the history of the Colosio Creek rainbow fish. The Colosio-ensis is a really, really cool fish, and maybe we save that story for another day, but it's a really cool rainbow fish. That's what got me back into the hobby. I ended up purchasing some. I couldn't believe they were available off Aquabid, my first time ever there, from Marcel W. Now on Aquabid, Marcel goes by Roseline17. He's probably one of the absolute best rainbow fish breeders in the United States, if not the world. Let's be a little honest, Marcel's awesome. Not sure if you know him. I do. Marcel and I are friendly. I've spoken to him more than a few times, and I have an open invitation to tour his place if I'm ever out in his area. Anyway, we've become friends, and I have been to his house several times. I'm a little jealous of that. In the past year, I now have Melanitania Colosio-ensis, Melanitania susii, Melanitania Herbert axelrodi, that's the yellow rainbow, one of the most common rainbows that's out there, Melanitania bozemanii, all from Marcel. So they're all going to be super high quality fish, because Marcel has amazing fish. And all in species tanks, so every one of these is a species-specific tank. So we're not mixing everything up here. I've been able to breed the Colosios and the bozemanii, and the axelrodi are exhibiting spawning behavior. Awesome, so you're doing really, really good with rainbow fish. Did I mention I really want to be able to grow aquarium plants? I would love to be able to provide a healthy and good home for all of these fish. So, rainbows don't necessarily live in heavily planted environments. There's lots of plant matter typically around them, but the waters themselves are not full of a lot of plant life. But what we have noticed is in captivity, us rainbow fish psychos, is that planted tanks not only help rainbows' colors pop out more, but also just in general, they tend to really, really, really do well in planted tanks. So it would make sense you want to do plants with all these rainbow fish. Local water conditions. I live 45 minutes west of Chicago, if that helps you dial in on general water parameters. So hard as a rock. Got it. The local water is what it is, hard, high pH, well buffered, so I doubt lowering pH would be a realistic goal. I have water softener, which of course takes the minerals out. I had 0 kH and 0 GH originally in the water, so that's after the water softener. To solve that, as opposed to using chemicals, I condition the water for 24 to 48 hours in a large garbage can with a pump and a heater, so it's all ready to use whenever I need it. I fill it with about 40 gallons of water from the softener and then 5 gallons direct from the well. So you're also using well water. And if we were to do the math on that, right, we could figure it out, but thankfully he gives us the numbers. The results give water that is approximately 14 degrees or so carbonate hardness and 5 degrees general hardness. Here are the tank parameters that we're going to talk about using an API master test kit. Tank size is 75 gallons. The pH is usually between 8.2 and 8.4. No ammonia, no nitrite. Nitrates are 3 to 5 ppm, so that's a little lean. When we're looking at a way to be successful with plants, that's even leaner than I like to go. I tend to like about 10 to 20. That's really like my sweet spot. I like to be as close to like that 10 personally when I'm dosing daily. If I'm dosing every few days, then I like that more like 20-ish ppm that kind of tails down toward 10 and then put it back, and I kind of yo-yo in that range when possible. Every so often, depending on your schedule, you're going to see like 40 ppm. You don't need to freak out, right? As long as you're 40 and lower, you're okay. But just keep in mind, 3 to 5 is really lean, so we might not be able to do like really high demand plants. Also, having higher pH, a lot of the highest demand plants really need soft water, so we probably want to skip those in the first place if we're going to look for success. But let's keep going. KH is typically between 14 and 16 drops to turn to color, and the GH is between 4 and 6. So after the water softener, we're keeping the overall hardness, so magnesium and calcium, relatively low, but not dangerously low, right? We're not super soft, but we are not crazy hard like we probably are out of the tap. But we're still keeping quite a lot of carbonate hardness, which just means your pH is going to be really stable, and it will elevate that pH to that 8 range that you've been dealing with. The good news is rainbows love that, right? That kind of water parameter, especially if you're doing really good water changes, you're keeping very clear and well oxygenated water, rainbows love that stuff. So no problems there. Water temp is typically between 75 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit. No CO2, using Echo Complete, or Echo Planted. I'm assuming that's the newer version of Fluval's Stratum, because they kind of have like two versions now. There's the Planted and then the regular Stratum. I'm just looking at getting into a few other things that I'm reading ahead. I see a few other Fluval products, so I'm going to assume that's correct. But we might be on Echo Complete, which also is a fine substrate, just not quite as much cation exchange capacity as like the Stratums and those similar like clay-based soils. Using a Fluval Plant 3.0 for lighting, fertilizer is the Aquarium Co-op Liquid, and root tabs. Okay, so we're using the probably the easy system. You might not be using every part of it, and you honestly might not need it given some of your other parameters, but Easy Green is a really, really good fertilizer. I tried to stick with crypts for low lighting, but I am currently sort of seeing what I can grow as opposed to aquascaping things nicely. You know, one of the things that I've found with rainbow fish is that they really appreciate when you just let this kind of stuff happen. When you just let plants do their thing, as long as they've got decent mid and upper water swim room, they kind of don't care. And sometimes when we try to do like the heavily aquascape things, we're actually at a risk because rainbows get a little dumb and get a little active. They start swimming around and sparring or courting the girls, and they'll like ram into a rock or a piece of wood or something like that. So sometimes if we keep it simpler, and even like when we look at Fallen Forest, right? I don't have a lot of hardscape going on here. I kind of have that big wood structure. These guys are begging for food all the time. But we have that big wood structure that comes through here, but it all stays mostly low except for the very edges of the tank, right? And then most of it was filling in is crypts. So you're kind of going a similar path to what I do in a lot of my tanks. The only difference is I live in extremely soft water naturally out of the tap, so I have to buffer up. You're in extremely hard water, so you have to take compensation to kind of bring it down a little bit to have your successful plants. But I think crypts is a good start because they can tolerate a lot. The Axelrod tank is new within the last week or so. The Bozemanite tank is several months old. There is a plant light about 3.5 feet above the Bozemanite tank that comes on midday for about 3 hours for the pothos plants that are on a lattice. I am a bit gun-shy about CO2 because of, well, the expense over 4 tanks, as well as I don't want to make any major mistakes with the Classio or Susii given their red list status. So Susii and Classio are both practically extinct in the wild. They have very, very limited populations. The Classioensis especially is, we're not even sure they exist in the wild anymore. The last time they were found, they weren't found in their original like water system. They were basically found in like a ditch nearby as opposed to the actual like small area of creek that they come from. I know I said I wasn't going to get into the Classioensis, but I like this fish's story so much, and they have this rad habitat.
Editor Bentley here. I wanted to give a quick summary of the actual habitat because when I was trying to do it off pure recollection, I made a major mistake and I realized it, so we'll do it right here. The Classio Creek is what is known as a karst resurgence of less than 5 meters in width, so it's very narrow, right? In the video, I think I said it was like a few hundred yards long. It was more that it's extremely narrow. This goes over the course of a couple of kilometers before it disappears into a subterranean outlet. So there's basically this very short, it's only a few kilometers, but it's very narrow and very shallow that is exposed to the surface where we could find the fish. The rest of it is completely subterranean, and more than likely rainbow fish do not live in that area. The habitat is in the vicinity of Malobolo village, consisted of a crystal clear stream that is relatively shallow. The maximum depth in the exposed area is about 1 meter, and it flows over white sand and has a number of limestone boulders in the area around this kind of lightly forested region, and you'll see a picture. We'll go back to regular me now.
Really unique and interesting, and there's a few others that kind of look close, which is where you get some of these other fish, but honestly, they're just really cool, and they come from this really interesting rare habitat as far as a rainbow fish is concerned, which is also why there's a big problem, because the last trip that folks went out there, which I believe was Gary Lang's group, they couldn't find any in the Classio Creek. They found them in basically the akin of a ditch, not far away, but not the main water system. So we don't know if they actually exist in their native habitat anymore. Hopefully they do. Hopefully they can recover, because there are some efforts being made to kind of vaguely protect that area by a native who lives out there, but we don't know, right? Anyway, let's get back to our email. Any advice you could offer would be greatly appreciated. It would be amazing if I were able to unlock the mysteries of growing aquarium plants. It's part of the hobby that has always eluded me, even though I read up on it. Thank you for the opportunity, as well for your videos and the time to take and shoot and edit them. I appreciate that. For those that don't know, shooting these doesn't necessarily take a ton of time if I've done a little bit of prep work. It's the editing that is the killer. A 20-minute video will often take me 4+ hours of editing. So, yeah. All right, let's get into talking. So we have a couple of clues in there, right? We're dealing with extremely hard water. If we look at the lighting too, the lighting is kept kind of intentionally very low. He sent screenshots of his settings here. So like the Bozeman tank is only going up to 5%. We're keeping this thing fairly low. I think, given that, I think all of these are 75 gallons, if I remember correctly, Scott, but if I'm off on this, we can make some adjustments. But I'm going to go under the assumption, because you're giving me one tank, that you're using multiple 75s, and looking at the pictures, they all look like 75-gallon tanks in the case of the Axelrod eye and the Bozeman eye. Let's just go under that blanket assumption that they're both 75 gallons. Because we're dealing with a 75-gallon, right, we have some reasonable height to the tank, and we've got a big footprint. So I think we can bring our light up a little bit, and that will help us with a few different plants. Now, looking at the pictures, I know you say you tried crypts. It almost looks like you have a few sword plants, so correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you said you're kind of experimenting, trying to see what you can grow. And swords typically like softer water. However, there are a few swords that have been documented to do fairly well in hard water because they're grown very regularly in Florida, and Florida has liquid rock too. You might not shy away from a few of the swords, especially some of the swords that have broader leaves to them naturally, so you don't necessarily want narrow leaves. And let me explain why. When we're dealing with low light, the broader the leaf, the more it can kind of capture things, and that helps us keep that light lower without having to push higher light and risking some other problems, potentially, algae, etc. Really, really fine leaf plants basically never have success. There's lots of exceptions, okay? But we'll just say, for our purposes here, really fine leaf plants don't typically have success in low light, hard water situations. They typically want higher light levels and softer water. So we want to avoid those things. And this would be things like a lot of your rotalas, many of your stems, honestly. One plant I know that does phenomenally well in hard water is Vallisneria. And there is a specific Vallisneria that is actually native to Lake Tanganyika, where the pH is something like 9. I mean, it's very hard water. And this type of Vallisneria has adapted. And there's quite a lot of it actually in our hobby. I have a local here in the Seattle area who grows specifically that version of Vallisneria on purpose and has distributed it all over the place because he's in like the AGA, Aquatic Gardeners Association, just in case, and he is really into plants. So he's kind of had a personal mission of distributing that particular variety of Vallisneria around, which we just call it high pH Val. In this area, and then we just know which one it is. But there is an option for Vallisneria, and rainbows can do phenomenally well in Vallisneria. It can act like a natural spawning mop, given that you've been breeding some of those fish quite a bit. So there's kind of that. One other plant that does fairly well in hard water is Cypress helferi. It's another kind of grassy plant. But unlike Vallisneria, it grows a bit more dense, and you actually have to go down and like separate the chunks away, kind of like you would with Areocollons. But Areos need very, very soft water, where Cypress actually does very good in harder water. So you could consider something like Cypress helferi, high pH Vallisneria. Some swords, some Anubias will do really well in hard water because they come from naturally hard water climates, but one of the things to keep in mind is that they need very clear water, typically. And while we normally associate them with lower light, they do tend to like a bit more light from time to time. However, that can risk algae, so that's where you kind of have this careful balance. I have a bunch, now granted my water's a bit softer than yours, but the GH is similar. Just the pHs and KHs are different in our water. My water typically is kept around about 4-ish degrees, 5-ish degrees general hardness if you're doing drop checks, right? But in the Guppy Mansion, I have just a Nubius, I think it's a... Which one do I have in there? Hold on. I think it's just a Barterai. It's a basic Barterai, the big broadleaves. But you could do this with like Nengi and a lot of the other larger leaf, bigger ones. I would avoid some of the smaller ones like Nana Petite. While they look really cool, they really do want softer water. The bigger ones can typically handle that harder water better. So you might try some of those, and they're pretty robust, tough plants. The only difference is you typically don't want to plant those into the substrate, although if we've watched Chris Lukup's video, there's tons of them that are in sand and doing just fine in the wild, but they are in these high water flow, extremely clear, clean water systems. So keep this in mind, right? I'm assuming with rainbows, you're keeping your water probably cleaner than I keep mine, especially with the amount of success you're having. So crypts can do well, right? Lots of crypts, but what I would stick to are your broader leaf, larger crypts. I would try to avoid some of your smaller crypts like the Parbas, and I wouldn't try any of like the really weird color variants like pink flamingo and things like that. They just naturally are a little tougher, but if you're doing regular like Wendetii, you might try, there's like 100 variants in Wendetii. So like Mi Oyas, Florida Sunset, and Florida Sunset actually is one you might try because it's a variant that's been cultivated in Florida, and Florida naturally has harder water. Yes, they grow most of these out of water, not fully submerged, but I can tell you that it's a pretty easy plant to grow. I grow it. I've got a bunch of it in a tank over here. Jacobsonite Pink is really, really cool, but that one tends to like a little bit softer water, so you might kind of avoid that. Some of the Petcheyes can be a little tough, or the Beckett eyes, but like Axelrodi can go with your Herbert Axelrodi rainbows. It actually can do fairly well in harder water too, although normally that's typically available as tissue culture, and tissue cultures can be a little harder to jumpstart in hard water. We're bouncing all over the place, so let me get to the real lesson here. Our first couple of clues that we're looking at in trying to solve this problem. We have lowish nitrates, 3 to 5 ppm. We're using extremely low light. We have hard water. We have very high pH, high carbonate hardness. But we don't have like very high mineral general hardness. So that actually is helping us. The carbonate hardness might be tough, but is not impossible. So here's the things that I would target and why. First, if you start planting a lot, I feel like you can bring that light up a little bit. In the case of the Bozemanite tank where you're at like 5, you might try like 25 or 30%. You have a relatively tall tank. It's not super tall, like a 125, but 75 gallons are 18 inches tall. So that water is getting a lot of dispersion, right? And that's going to bring the PAR, or the intensity, down a bit. So if we up it a little bit, that is going to increase the range of plants we can keep. I think you are actually doing a smart thing sticking to mostly root-feeding plants, because when we have that more high pH water system, that can make it a little harder to pull some of those nutrients out of the water column. So root tabs are going to be your friend, and plants that have a heavier focus on root feeding, crypts. Some Aponegitans, most of them kind of like it a little softer in the water, but there's a few that don't mind hard water. The Vallisterias, the Cypress Health Rye, some Swords, these are all good options that really rely on root feeding, pretty robust, tend to have larger leaves so they can handle that lower light, and often like longer light exposure as opposed to big high intensity. And that's one of the things you might have to do to have success with plants. You might have to have the lights on for a bit more than 3 hours. You might need to be looking at like at least 6, and you can do it in little bursts, but really plants need a certain amount of time to get photosynthesis and to kind of convert all those things they're bringing in into energy and grow. And if we have too short of a time window for lighting, that can be one of the things that is hurting us. Let me address CO2. When you're doing with 4 tanks, especially if they're all in a similar space, that can be okay, because you can just run a multiple tap regulator and run individual lines. And honestly, with a lot of the plants you're looking at, you don't need CO2. You just need time and some small adjustments. And the next thing I would do is, I want to get your nitrates higher, but I want to do it in a way that won't really register on test kits, which is at the roots. So I think by having root tabs, you already said you have root tabs, that's going to help us to feed a lot of these plants that rely mostly on root level nutrition, and then keeping that 3 to 5 nitrate in the water column is perfectly fine, because that can help inhibit algae. Last little piece of advice. When you're changing your light and testing things, do it slowly. Don't do big jumps. Like, if you're at, say, 20% on one tank, and you're like, they're still kind of struggling, bring it up to 30, and then wait for 2 weeks to a month. What you really want to do in this exploratory phase, because I think this is a good lesson for everybody watching and not just Scott. When you're trying to learn what plants work well with your water, plants can be relatively forgiving. Now, when they're fresh and they've got to convert and all that stuff, it can be tough. Don't get me wrong. But they're more forgiving than a lot of other things. So if you have a little bit of patience and you just watch them, they'll tell you whether or not they're doing well. And they can usually put you on the right path, because we've looked at like what nutrient deficiencies look like, but light issues present themselves pretty obviously too, where plants start trying to get really long and thin because they're reaching. And if you know that you have a really broadleaf plant naturally, and it's producing lots of long, thin leaves, it needs more light. If you have something like in your crypts, you're getting really long, thin stems before the actual leafage and foliage portion occurs, it's trying to get closer to the light. If we get more light, it'll stay more compact and get that bushy look that we're used to with most crypts. One other plant that I would suggest, Bulbitis. Bulbitis actually does phenomenally well. It's a slower growing plant, it's an epiphyte, but it does phenomenally well in harder water systems. Probably better than Java Fern. I honestly think it's a better alternative for a lot of people that deal with high pH water like you are. But Java Ferns can have success too. They just tend to be a little more finicky, so you might try Bulbitis first. What's our plan of action, right? We're going to increase nitrates, but we're going to do it at the roots. So it's probably not going to show up in our testing, but that's an important thing, right? We're going to make sure there's plenty of food at the roots. And you could probably do root tabs with a lot of your slower growers 3 weeks to a month. In that kind of rotation should be fine. But if you start noticing that like, hey, all my crypts are getting lots of leaves and they're getting big and bold, we might want to put one in the kind of area the crypts are every couple weeks instead, or we start spreading it out more, right? Instead of one in a batch, we might realize that like this crypt area went from about this big around to say like this area, we might plant like 3 in kind of a triangular shape, right? To make sure we're getting plenty of nutrition available at the roots. If we're doing swords, put 1 or 2 right under the plant. As deep as possible, it's going to help the root system, and more importantly, that's where it likes to consume all its nutrition to begin with. In the case of Anubiases, if you go for some of the big leaf ones, make sure that you're having at least a little bit of stuff in the water column. Your 3 to 5 nitrates is probably fine, I'm going to be honest. You could go up that 5 to 10 range, could be a target if you start doing a bit more epiphytic plants like the Bulbitis and Anubias, just to make sure that they've got stuff, but they're all kind of low demand, slower growers, so they don't need a ton. You don't need to be like 20 to 40 range. 5 to 10, it will be just fine. Consider increasing light. That's the biggest thing. I think right now, one of the things you're doing is your amount of light for the height of your tank is going to severely limit some of your plants. And if we add just a little bit more light and we just kind of touch on it and we kind of play with it, maybe we top out at say like 50% when we start seeing some pretty serious plant density going on, especially at that one that's like, several inches off to help those pothos. Maybe we push that bad boy up to like 50%, 45%, somewhere in that range, still provide enough low light levels to feed all those plants inside the aquarium, and the pothos that's out of the aquarium won't care, right? It'll just be happy to get even more light. It'll probably grow like a weed, and then we might have other problems where the pothos is doing too much work and the plants in the aquarium can't do as much work. But we'll figure that out when we get there. Let me know what your thoughts are here. This is a different one. I know this was a little more rambly because it's not as like, when we're solving problems, it's really easy to narrow in. But when we're trying to give advice on how to get started, it can get a little easy to go wild and free. You guys know how I am. I get a little scatterbrained because I just love babbling about this stuff. But if you've enjoyed this video, if you have a similar environment to Scott, I want to hear from you guys in the comments down below. How have you found success? Is it just that you found plants from a local plant person who grows them their own, so they're already kind of acclimated to those water systems? That's another thing you can do, by the way, Scott. Find people that grow it locally, use their plants. Really easy that way, because plants will adjust over time. Yeah, I just want to hear from you guys down below. Maybe you've never had hard water, so there's certain things you can't try. Let me know in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a like. Consider subscribing if you're not subscribed. These are literally the free and easy ways to tell old Papa YouTube, hey, I really like what's going on here. I think someone else will too. It helps us grow. It helps us keep doing what we're doing. All us small fish tubers. Yeah, that's how you can help us the most, and it's absolutely free. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.